Okay, so good evening again to our regulars. I see there are some new names there, so welcome to the people who have just joined us for the first time. My name is Alan Freedman. I'm Vice President of the Australian Jewish Association, and I will be the MC for this evening. And also on your screens, as you can see, are David Adler, President of the AJA, as well as our special guest for tonight, Bryan Rigg, who we will introduce in a moment. And we must thank him for getting up at 2 o'clock or 2:30 a.m. for us. As usual with our sessions, we'll be speaking with Bryan for about 30 minutes, after which we'll open up the discussion with a live Q&A from the audience. So please have some questions ready. And as I usually do, I remind everybody that it helps if you can indicate your interest in asking a question by clicking on the participants icon and then on the raise hand or a green tick icon along the bottom. That sends a message to us that we know you want to ask a question, and it's a bit easier than trying to follow this in the chat, because that sometimes gets fairly full. Everybody, of course, has been muted to prevent any annoying noises during the first part of the session, but we will allow people to unmute themselves for question time. Now, our subject tonight is probably a little out of left field for most of the audience. It certainly was for me. Our guest tonight is Bryan Rigg, who is a graduate of Yale and Cambridge universities, a former US Marine, and he has also served in the IDF. He has served on the board of the Dallas Holocaust Museum and is currently on the American Jewish Committee board in Dallas, Texas. Our topic tonight is an extraordinary, compelling, and little-known perspective of World War II. And Bryan is the author of a book titled Hitler's Jewish Soldiers. Now, this book won the William E. Colby Award for Military History and was featured on NBC TV's Dateline show and has been translated into 11 languages. Bryan, welcome to the Australian Jewish Association and our Zoom event. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you, Alan, for that warm introduction.
Thank you. Now, Bryan, I just want to start because I believe you have an interesting personal story on how you came to be interested in tonight's topic. Could you just give us a little summary of this background, please?
Sure. I think you're referring to how I found out about my Jewish background.
Yeah.
Yeah, so in 1992, I had gone to Germany to learn the language of my ancestors and also to research the areas where my family came from in Germany. Since the wall had come down in 1989, the areas where my family had immigrated from were now open to me because they were in Lower Saxony, and also Prussia. And some of those archives were open. Obviously, Prussia right now is part of Poland and Russia. But Lower Saxony and Saxony were then open to me. Dessau, Leipzig, Brandenburg, area as well, and Dubin was the town that I went to. And I wanted to go and find out just who my ancestors were, where they came from. I didn't have any idea that I would find Jewish ancestry in my background. But when I went down to these towns and started researching my family, I found that I had all these Jews in the family branches, and I was really kind of confused at that time. I had basically only learned about Jews in church here in Texas. So I just had, visions of an old white guy coming off of a mountain with two rocks in his hands. I just, I didn't have any understanding what this meant. So when I returned to Yale University to start my sophomore year, I went to the Hillel and sat down with several of my Jewish friends and said, what does it mean to be Jewish, and who is a Jew, and so on. And an ultra-Orthodox rabbi from Or Sameach was there, Rabbi Kasnet, and he sat down with me and he got all my papers out and he started mapping out my family's tree. And when he got all of it, very excited all of a sudden, he said, Baruch Hashem, you're a Jew. And I said, well, what does that mean? I always thought I was a WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. And he said, well, according to Halakha, it comes down to your mother's line, you're Jewish, welcome to the tribe. And that was very eye-opening to me, because I started thinking to myself, what would have happened to my family had we remained in Germany? What does it mean to be Jewish? Why did my family come here and hide it? why is there anti-Semitism? And so that really played large in my imagination at that time. And that summer, when I found out about my Jewish background, I also had a strange and interesting meeting with an old man in a theater in Germany. I had actually helped him find a seat because when he had walked in, I was already there and it was dark and he was a little discombobulated with his surroundings and leaned up against the wall. And I saw that he was unsure of his footing. So I immediately got up with my good Texas upbringing, helped him find a seat, and we started talking. He quickly heard that my German wasn't very good, so he started speaking to me in fluent British English. And he said if I had any questions during the film that I should just ask. Well, the film is Europa, Europa, or in German it was called Ich war Hitler, Jung und Salomon. And Europa, Europa, it's on Netflix. It's a fairly interesting film. I recommend it to those of you who have not seen it. It's about a German Jew, Shlomo Perel, who, due to Nazi persecution in 1936, leaves and goes to Poland. In 1939, when Germany invades Poland, he goes to Russia. In 1941, when Germany invades Russia, he has nowhere else to run to, and he's taken prisoner outside of the city of Minsk. And during his interrogation, he emphatically denied to the German military authorities that he was Jewish, and he said that he was a Volksdeutscher, an ethnic German instead. His testimony was accepted, and because he could speak Polish, Russian, and German, he was brought in to the German unit that had conducted this interrogation. It was a tank unit, as their Dolmetscher, their translator, and he spent 1 year in this military unit all the way up to Leningrad fighting with them. He was a young boy, 15 years old, and his company commander, Captain von Munchau, after 1 year of fighting there, decides to adopt the young man, and he sends him back to a Hitler Youth Prep School in Berlin, where he survived the war. Well, after this movie, I asked the gentleman next to me, his name is Peter Milius, what he thought about it. He was very emotional, and he said, hey, wait, it's very close to my own history. Would you like to go talk? And I said, sure. So we walked down the street to a bar where he told me a story for, several hours. Peter Milius was of Jewish descent and had served also in the Wehrmacht, the German military of World War II. He told me about his fear for his, Jewish mother during the war. He told me about his brother dying in a military unit outside of Leningrad. In fact, it was a neighboring unit to where he was. And when he went over to visit his brother, his company commander basically told him, hey, I need you to identify your brother. He just got, somebody has his phone on.
John, I think that might be you.
Too much trouble.
Yeah, John, can you please mute your computer?
Yeah, it's done now.
Okay, great. So, he went to go visit his brother, and the company commander said, hey, I'm sorry, your brother was in a bunker that got blown up by some artillery. You're going to have to help me identify his body. And his brother actually had been decapitated during this artillery barrage. And he told me about that experience. At the end of the war, he was taken prisoner by the Russians, spent 4 years in a Russian prisoner war camp, and then was returned when Konrad Adenauer opened up, Stalin to be amenable to sending back a lot of the German POWs. So after this experience, I started thinking to myself, because a month later, I found out about my own Jewish background that I just described. So after this, I was thinking, what are the coincidences that this kid from Texas goes to Germany, watches a movie about a Jew who served in the Nazi military, only to sit next to a Wehrmacht veteran of Jewish descent. And then 1 month later, I found out about my own Jewish background. And one story that, played in my mind also at this time is I had a great uncle who fought in the Meuse-Argonne offensive of World War I as an American soldier, American doughboy. And I've never been able to verify this story with documents, but one of my uncles, Uncle John Little, told me that my uncle Otto, who was in the battle, he would go around like all American GIs do. Even today, American veterans are kleptomaniacs when they get into a military zone. They'll take medals, diaries, insignia of the dead, and so on, especially in World War II and World War One. And so my uncle, he took off some stuff from a couple of dead Germans. One guy had the same last name as him. He brought it back to my great-grandfather at the time. My great-grandfather said, yeah, this is my uncle's kid. This is your cousin. So something else that also played in my head was, here was this cousin of mine that could serve for Germany in World War One, die for the fatherland, and had he survived, 25 years later, he'd be stuck in a crematorium, after being gassed in Auschwitz or Treblinka, Sobibor. And that also played with my mind. Like, how did that happen? What's going on here? So there was a lot of interesting forces of destiny, if you will, Alan, that brought me to start looking into this subject matter. That was the catalyst to do now a 25-year research project that's led to 4 books.
Yeah. So Bryan, how old were you when all of this happened, and what effect did it have on your life? All of a sudden, finding out that you were technically Jewish.
Well, when I found this out, to answer your question, I mean, it started me asking a lot of questions about identity, and who am I, and also to explore my own family tree and talk to my relatives. And, it's kind of funny. I came back and I had a little bit of like a miniature family reunion, and I was showing a lot of the documents to my relatives. And, a lot of my family were like, we have enough problems as it is as a family. We don't need anti-Semitism too. I'm like, well, Jesus was a rabbi. He was a Christian, and most of you guys are Christians. And they're like, well, no, that was different. I was like, no, it's not. He was just a different sect of Judaism for many years, and now it gave birth to your religion. But they were very disconcerted at first. My mom eventually kind of embraced it, and she goes every now and then to a Messianic synagogue. And my Rabbi Kasnet from Orsamaic, when I told him that, he's like, "Oh, Vay, that's worse. It's better if you she never found out. Don't want to go to those places." So it started me really embracing it. Coming from the question of why do I not know about this? Well, now I want to know about it, and I am who I am, and so I enjoy talking to a lot of people at Hillel about my Jewish background, what it means. Rabbi Kesnick, Rabbi Korlin, Rabbi Gottlieb eventually got me a scholarship to go to Israel in 1993 and 94 to study in a yeshiva and learn more about my Jewish background. And then 4 years after that, I did the other kind of extreme and did the Marva unit, where you're able to go over to Israel for 3 months and serve in the Israeli military and learn more about Israel, what it means if you're going to make Aliyah. And then, I decided I'm going to do something for my Jewish ancestry, if you will, and with the subject matter that I fell into with Shlomo Perel and Peter Milius about people of Jewish descent who served in the Nazi military, I decided to explore that more. So finding out about this reshaped the way that I look at myself. My son wants to do the same unit that I did in Marava. And so my kids have been raised knowing about their Jewish background, being proud of it. It's about family. It's about education. It's about tzedakah, giving back to your community. These things I embrace and I'm very proud of now. And so it radically changed my life. When I was in the Marine Corps, every night we would get in our barracks and we'd stand at attention. We would say, God, country, corps, and put one foot out, put our head down, and put our hands together. And then the drill instructor asked one person to give a Catholic prayer and another guy to give a Protestant prayer. Well, after being there for about 3 weeks in my platoon of 30 men, there was a guy named Schweitzer, there was a guy by the name of Levine, and then there was me, Rigg. And we were the 3 Jews in the unit, and I was the only one that knew the Shema. So I went to the company. I went to the company commander, Captain Erickson, and I said, "Hey, we do a Protestant prayer and a Catholic prayer, but 10% of the unit is Jewish. Can I do a Shema, the Jewish prayer?" And he says, "Sure, absolutely." So for the next 7 weeks, every night after the Catholic and Protestant prayer, I did my best to belt out my most beautiful Shema that I could. And I had a lot of people ask me about, well, what is Judaism all about? And, what is the culture like and so on. So it gave me an opportunity to educate some people, especially a couple people who were very passionately Christian, and they didn't even know that they were anti-Semitic in some respects. The old ancient Christian view, Jews are Christ killers and all this other stuff, and they're going to hell. And so it allowed me to hopefully, create more tolerance, talk about these issues of human rights. How do we prevent people looking at ethnicities and blood and race, and getting to a higher level, realizing that we're part of one race, the human race. So it changed my life dramatically, Alan.
Yeah, very, very, very interesting. The title of your book is Hitler's Jewish Soldiers, which is certainly very thought-provoking. Can you take us through the journey of writing this book? How did it happen, and what sort of things did you uncover?
Well, I'm kind of the last one picked in the stars in 1971 to write a book of history. I am cursed or blessed, depending on how you look at it, of having failed first grade twice. I have ADHD and dyslexia. Writing was always difficult for me. Speaking, I had a horrible speech impediment when I was a kid. My first 5 years of my life, I could barely even, get a few coherent words out. I was cursed by malapropisms. I would always kind of switch words up. Weather would become wither, when would become what, and so on. But I had some wonderful teachers along the way that got me back on track. And I'm actually working on a book right now called Overcoming Learning Disabilities, where I'm exploring it. So, when I found out about the subject matter, about Jews and men of Jewish descent who served in the Nazi military, starting with Peter and Shlomo, I wasn't thinking I was necessarily going to write a book about it. I remember I gave Peter, after that long night in the bar where he told me his whole story, I gave him a big hug because he was very emotional. And I later found out from his family, and this is the first time he'd ever talked about it, his kids didn't even know the stories that I was learning that night. And he was in tears, very emotional. I gave him a big hug and I said, "I will not forget you." Now, what I thought I was going to do with him is maybe find enough material after looking at Shlomo Perel, the protagonist of Europa, the movie, and Peter Milius, and maybe trying to find another 5 or 6 guys. I thought, hey, this might be an interesting essay to write for a history class at Yale, and then I would put it in the archive there. Possibly even get enough material to write a senior essay at Yale, which is a 60 to 70 page document, and that's what you have to finish up to get a history degree from Yale University. And I thought maybe I could do that, and then I would put it in the archive. Once again, I would not forget him by documenting the story. So when I came back to Yale University in 1992 to start my sophomore year, I began researching this subject matter, and I knew I needed to learn more about World War II and the Holocaust, so just taking survey courses at Yale. And I started asking some of my professors there, Paula Hyman, the head of Judaic Studies, Henry Turner, the head of German Studies, the head of military history, Jeffrey Parker, political scientist, Paul Kennedy, wonderful minds, about looking into this. And they all said I wouldn't find anything. Don't waste your time, And I asked them, hey, do you know anybody who's looked into this? Or have you ever looked into it and didn't find anything? And they all told me, no, we haven't looked into this, and we don't know anybody who's looked into it. I said, okay, well, hey, I'll see what I can do. So this year, I just took a lot of courses on history, worked on my writing, and I returned back in 1993 in the summer, and I lived with Peter Milius, the guy who I met in the theater. I lived with him and his family. Started documenting him and his brother more. I found about a few more cousins that he had. There was also who were also in the military, of Jewish descent, served on the Russian front. And then they started giving me, when I met some of these cousins and so on, some other names of people who they knew. One was Helmut Schmidt, the former Chancellor of Germany, who had a Jewish grandfather and was in the Luftwaffe. So I came back in 1993 to start my junior year, and I started conducting independent studies about World War II and the Holocaust. I started using LexIs research tools of scanning articles from newspapers and journals and magazines. And by the end of this year, I had documented seven living Wehrmacht veterans of Jewish descent. So I wanted to go to Europe, primarily Germany, to interview these guys. And so I applied for several small scholarships from Yale University, and I got many of them. And I decided to take off a year between my junior and senior years and go to Germany and interview these people and try to get 20 to 30 interviews, thinking this now would be a very good foundation for a senior essay at Yale University to really end my time there and get honors in history and maybe even get some wonderful scholarships like the Rhodes or Marshall or Fulbright to continue on graduate studies. So I went over to Europe, started researching these 7 guys, and in the first month alone, Alan, I interviewed over 20 guys. And by the end of this year, living over in Germany, I had interviewed 200 men of Jewish descent who served in the Nazi military, and I collected over 10,000 pages of documents. I started getting Hitler documents. I was getting helmets, Lugers, daggers, medals, diaries, you name it. It was amazing. My professor at Cambridge University, Jonathan Steinberg, calls me the sorcerer's apprentice. Once I called up all these documents like the floodwaters, I couldn't stop it. So I came back to Yale in 1995 to start my senior year. I took a lot of those documents to the curmudgeon professor, Henry Turner, brilliant historian, tough teacher. And I took him several of the documents, many of them signed by Hitler, several of them about the German high-ranking command in the army that was Aryanizing high-ranking soldiers. Generals and admirals were actually being Aryanized, quote unquote, and allowed to serve in the military. Second in command of the Luftwaffe, Erhard Musch, was a field marshal, a 5-star general. He was Aryanized. The guy who developed the operational concept of blitzkrieg maneuver warfare and combined arms, artillery, tanks, planes, and infantry, focusing on a Schwerpunkt, the center of gravity. He designed that whole strategy. Helmut Wilberg was a half Jew, was Aryanized by Hitler, and so on. As I sat down with Henry Turner and showed him all this, he was just blown away. So I really worked hard to write up a good senior essay. I got honors in history, and then I got what is the equivalent of the Rhodes Scholarship, but it's only for Harvard and Yale to go to either Oxford or Cambridge. It's called the Henry Fellowship, and I decided to go to Cambridge and study with Jonathan Steinberg. When I was over in England, I continued on making trips over to mainland Europe, like every 2 weeks, to conduct more interviews and collect more documents. By the end of this year, I had conducted 450 interviews, and I had collected over 30,000 pages of documents, letters, diaries. Going into people's homes, I would find a treasure trove of documents, and then they would help me triangulate how to find more documents in the German archives. And I started going around all the different German archives in Munich and Dresden and Berlin and other Rothstadt, finding more and more documents. And then I wrote up my master's, got honors with that, continued on, and then turned it into a PhD. And that was conferred on me in the Senate House in 2002. And when with my ADHD and dyslexia, going back to that, the one thing I had learned about early on that you want to get criticism from people who you know care about you. So, and you want to be vulnerable and open because that's the only way you learn to grow. A lot of people are very private about their writing and they take it very personally when you criticize it. And I saw that when I was a professor for many years. I've taught probably a total of about 1,500 kids in my 5.5 years of being a professor. And I could see a lot of people take it very personally. I had learned not to take it personally at all. The only way I was going to get better was to be able to get feedback and constructive criticism. So what I'm getting at is when I had a working PhD, before I had finally submitted it, I had collected from 1995 until 2001 over 120 different names of people who I had been in touch with throughout the years who took a really strong interest in my work. Teachers, professors, lawyers, rabbis, and so on, military, retired military officers, and so on. So when I had a working document ready to go, I had over 100 people that had always been very interested in my research, and I wrote them. I said, "Would you read my manuscript and give me some feedback?" I had 96 say yes. So every few weeks, I would send out 5 or 6 documents, manuscripts, and I would start getting the feedback from people. Then I would incorporate their information, and then send out another batch, another 5 or 10 guys. And after about a year and a half of doing this, I had, if you think about it, having almost 100 people on average, maybe they have 30 or 40 years of adult life. I was able to tap into like 1,000 years of reading and thinking and wisdom and information that these guys had that I could have never got in my own life. And so my book was very polished. I submitted it, did my orals, defended it, and was then awarded a PhD. And along that journey, a couple of the professors who looked at this work were so impressed with it that they started passing it around to different publishing houses. And that's how I got my book, Hitler's Jewish Soldiers, published, because James Coram, wonderful historian, who wrote The Roots of Blitzkrieg, basically got me in with the University Press of Kansas, which is one of the premier publishing houses here in America for military history. And so that was my journey, and and that's how a kid with ADHD and dyslexia finally got a manuscript out there as a pretty decent work of history in 2002.
Well done, David. I think you've got a question.
Yeah. Look, Mark, Bryan, thank you so much for your fascinating story. I'd like to focus a little bit on the actual Jewish soldiers in Germany. Do you have any idea how many there were? You described a few of them in very senior positions, but are we talking about a few hundred, a few thousand, tens of thousands?
No, this is worth, I talked to mathematicians, statisticians, and demographers to really do a very good job with this. And I also looked at birth rates, mixed marriage rates, and discharge numbers of what the Nazis called half Jews and quarter Jews. So before I answer your question and give you the number, which I think will be very shocking, to understand this, you got to look at Germany, not how a lot of people usually do from back then. A lot of people think of just the Jews and then think of the quote unquote Nazis, Aryans. And they forget that when Hitler came into power, you had hundreds of years of assimilation that had been going on in Germany. And so when Hitler came on the scene and said Jews are bad, he was faced with how Jewish did you have to be bad? And they never came up with a satisfactory answer, but their first major step to dealing with that issue was the Aryan laws, or the Aryan paragraph of 1933, 1934, which basically said anybody who's a non-Aryan is not really welcomed in our country. And they basically said if you had one Jewish grandparent or one non-German grandparent, but that basically meant one non-Jewish grandparent, one Jewish grandparent or one non-Aryan grandparent, whatever that be. Could be a gypsy, it could be a Muslim, something like that. They would say, okay, or a Japanese, you were a non-Aryan. And this created chaos within the bureaucracy and in society. So then in 1935, they came out with the Nuremberg laws, and they specified that really, hey, it's not really non-Aryans that we don't like. We just don't like Jews. And so they said a full Jew is a person who had 3 or more Jewish grandparents. So anybody who's basically above 50% Jewish was a Jew, and or a person who focused on the Jewish religion or community. If you were a member of a Jewish Gemeinde, Jewish community center, or if you were of a synagogue, even if you didn't have any Jewish ethnicity, so to speak, you were also considered a full Jew. Then you had these 2 new legal classifications. They were legal fictions. That was the half Jew, 2 Jewish grandparents, and the quarter Jew, 1 Jewish grandparent. These are also called Jüdische Mischlinge. The Jewish Mischlinge of the first degree was a half Jew, and the Jewish Mischling of the second degree was a quarter Jew. And then a Germanic Aryan was a person who had 4 German Aryan grandparents. Now, for all the Nazi talk about the Jews being a race, they ultimately had to use religious criteria to define that race. Death certificates, marriage certificates, birth certificates throughout Germany always noted a person's religion involved. And as a result, the Nazis had to use these documents to define somebody's race instead of looking at their blood or if they had flat feet or, big noses and so on. Just shows you how bankrupt the Nazi racial laws were with how they were defining people. Now, when you look at this, these numbers of assimilation, and you start looking at the numbers of birth rates, and the size of families, and also looking at how many were drafted, because by German law, people who were half Jews and quarter Jews actually had to serve. They didn't have a choice. They were drafted. This is what's crazy. A lot of people don't know this. So I conservatively estimate that 60,000 half Jews and 90,000 quarter Jews served in the German armed forces during World War II. And then I extrapolate from those numbers because, the full Jews, it's very hard to find out how many people were actually in hiding. But out of the 2,000 men that I documented personally, name, rank, and so on, 150 of those guys were what the Nazis would consider full Jews. So if there was 150,000 Mischlinge, Jewish Mischlinge who served in the German armed forces, then you're probably looking at a conservative maybe 8 to 10,000 so-called full Jews that were also in hiding. So you're looking at about a population of 150, 160,000 men during World War II served in the Wehrmacht who were of Jewish descent.
Okay.
And so it was a pretty shocking number that I came up with.
It is. Bryan, my last question before we throw it open. Can you say something about what was in their heads? Were they motivated by self-preservation when things turned really nasty? Or did they actually believe in the Third Reich? What was driving these people?
Well, you have to, very good question. And it's something I struggled with a lot. On average, every man who I documented lost between 6 and 7 relatives in the Shoah, in the Holocaust. And these guys were persecuted. They were treated like second-class citizens. They were second-class soldiers. Only when they proved themselves in battle were they given special clemency to rise up to the ranks, or were they Aryanized? And Hitler did this for thousands of guys, Aryanizing them, not only for the field marshals and generals who were helping him with his military, but he did it with, Frontschwein, grunts, corporals, privates, sergeants. He was so obsessed with his racial ideology that he would literally look at applications during the height of the Battle of Stalingrad to see if a guy was blonde enough, blue-eyed enough, and was brave enough to be allowed to be brought into the Aryan fold because his Aryan blood dominated him. Really kind of sick pseudoscience, obviously. Now, getting back to these men's mentality. Most of these guys, they're drafted in the military. They don't have a choice. They can't go to the draft board and say, "You're treating my family poorly. You're discriminating against me. I feel Jewish. I don't want to serve. They would have been shot in a totalitarian state. Also, most of these men came from very strong military traditions. Their Jewish great-grandfathers had served, Hardenberg and Stein fighting Napoleon. Their grandfathers had served in the Franco-Prussian War. Their fathers had served in World War I. So for them to serve against an enemy they hated, Russia, or France for that matter, was a no-brainer for them. These guys were enemies, whether you had Hitler in there or you had Hindenburg or whoever. But obviously they're in a strange situation that they're being drafted during a time when dad's losing his job, mom's being spit on the street, grandma's being arrested by the Gestapo just because of their ethnicity. Now, if you read a wonderful book called Twisted Road to Auschwitz, you'll see that it was very hard for these guys to get ahead mentally about what was going on. I mean, in the first 2 years of Hitler's rule, you had the nationalistic Jews run by Julius Schultz, who supported Hitler because they believed Hitler was going to do away with Marxism and communism. And when Hitler was ranting about the Jews, they thought he was talking about, okay, these Jewish communists like Lenin and Trotsky and so on.
Yeah, I mean, most people don't understand that there were actually a significant body. It was the Verband National Deutsche Juden.
Yeah, that's right. Very good. Yeah, and they thought, and they also didn't like the Ostjuden. It's the old rivalry or conflict between the Ostjuden and the Yekas. The German Jews, the highbrow, assimilated, educated Jewish elite that are looking down at their cousins who are still in the shtetl, who are still Hasidic Jews, ultra-Orthodox. I mean, a little side note. And maybe my buddy from my Israeli time, the Israeli military time, is on with us right now, Shimon Freegood. He'll remember our Rasap, our drill sergeant. And one day that drill sergeant took me off to the side when he found out about my research. And he basically told me, he's like, you know what, Brian, this is my Israeli drill sergeant. He said, Brian, if Hitler had killed all the Dosim, the ultra-Orthodox, this world would be a better place. I couldn't believe I heard that. But the reason why I bring that up is that was the feeling in Germany at the time with German Jews, that they were like these Eastern European Jews who are the they're creating this anti-Semitism. We want to get rid of them. And so many of the people in the first couple of years of Hitler's reign were thinking that Hitler's anti-Semitism came from that they want to get rid of communism, which is a Jewish movement, and they want to get rid of these Eastern European Jews that don't contribute at all. They study all day. They live on the welfare. They don't want to serve in the military. They're not patriotic. Get rid of them. And as the Nazi right took on the momentum of more and more persecution, these guys, a lot of times, they didn't know what to do. But most of them did not know about the Holocaust, even when they were in the military ranks. This is one of the most shocking findings of my research. I thought when I first started this research that all of these men knew about the Holocaust. How could they not know about it? Shockingly, I found the opposite to be true. Yes, many of these men knew about persecution, but that the persecution was going to start killing their relatives was beyond their knowledge. I mean, that the people they had grown up with, their neighbors, their teachers, their politicians, their own relatives who were, quote unquote, the Aryan side of their families, were going to start killing people like them was beyond their knowledge. They knew about deportations, but where people were being actually deported to, was, beyond their knowledge as well. They knew about concentration camps, but that people were being killed in those camps were beyond their imaginations. And so what really drove this home for me is that many of these guys, half Jews, they were creating a lot of problems for the Nazis because they were coming home in their military uniforms and they were going to deportation stations with their grandma and aunt and uncle and whatnot and saying, hey, you can't deport these people. They're related to me. And look, I have the Iron Cross. I've served on the Russian front. And Hitler was getting all these complaints. And Hitler basically said, hey, we're going to either have to protect the Jewish parents of these half-Jewish soldiers, or we're going to have to discharge the half-Jews. Well, we cannot protect full Jews. Discharge the half-Jews. And so you started having these massive discharges in 40, 41, and 42. And these guys, thousands of guys came back home, and they, for the next couple of years, just worked and studied. And here's an irony of ironies. While their Aryan comrades and brothers in arms had the honor to go to Russia and get slaughtered on the battlefields there, these guys are home, sleeping with, lonely wives and young, single German women, studying, working, and they're surviving at a higher rate than their Aryan comrades. But by 1944, Hitler decided, hey, we need to use these thousands and thousands of military trained half Jewish men, and they started sending them off to forced labor camps. Now, the question is this: if these half Jewish soldiers knew about the Holocaust and knew that many of their relatives had been deported to their deaths, why did these young men report to their own deportation stations? And the vast majority, in the end of 1944, started to report to these stations, and only when they got to these camps did they go, oh my God. I mean, had they really known what was going on, why didn't they go into hiding? Why did they not ignore the notices they got from the Gestapo or the workers' departments that they were getting from the different cities? Why didn't they try to get to Switzerland or Sweden? Why didn't they take a pistol with them? Some of them still had their arms.
That's great, mate. We've got a whole list of people now that want to ask you questions, so I'll hand to Alan to open, and we'll just need to keep questions and answers.
Okay. But to end on that note, the only when they got to these camps did they start to realize, oh my God, now I know what happened. And these camps were forced labor camps. They weren't concentration camps, and they weren't death camps. So just to end on that. So sorry about that, Alan. Yeah, fire away with the questions, Alan.
No, it's a fascinating subject. Okay, we've got Saul, Eva, Ron, Moish, and Dennis. So Saul, you were first up. Please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Do you not think actually it's a fascinating topic, and you speak so well and so passionately about it? But do you not think that one should really distinguish very much the soldier like Erhard Milch, who became Generalfeldmarschall, and of whom it wasn't Hitler, it was Goering said in 1933, when Milch was accused of being a Jew, wer a Jud is, bestim I. Who a Jew is, I decide. And Milch wholeheartedly took part in using slave labor in the Luftwaffe. Milch was, when he surrendered to the British on the 4th of May, 1945, Brigadier Derek Mills Roberts, Milch gave him his field marshal's baton.
And he got slammed across
and Roberts
the head.
broke it over his head, fracturing Milch's skull with it, because Roberts had just liberated Bergen-Belsen.
Yeah, okay. You're right to bring this up.
Those people who were sentenced at Nuremberg to life, though he got out in 1954, from the others, the ones like Perel. You have to distinguish the various kinds of Jews, the ones wholeheartedly, the ones hiding, the ones who knew a little but not much.
Thanks.
Saul, you're very.
Brian has to say.
Yeah. So Saul, you're very, very well educated and read on that. I hope you would like reading my a third book called Lives of Hitler's Jewish Soldiers, which I write a short biography of Milch. I'm one of the few historians that was able to get in with the family, talk to the Milch family about their experiences. You are right. Most of these guys were just trying to survive. They were in the German military, and they weren't criminals at all. They were just, caught up in a horrible situation. There were a few guys that were just nasty, horrible human beings, and Milch was one of these people. And so I do bring that out, that he was very, very much ambitious for his career. He knew about slave labor, going to Dachau as well as to Auschwitz, and he should have been hung at Nuremberg. And they did let him out, and he then got back in the civilian sector and helped run Lufthansa for many years. He was a brilliant mind logistically. He was a moral failure as a human being, but he's a tiny minority of the thousands of people who I documented. But you're right to bring out that there is a distinction there. And in my book, Hitler's Jewish Soldiers, I go into these various areas, Saul, that you so astutely brought up.
Okay, thanks. Now, Eva, your turn. I'm not sure. I think you're currently unmuted. So please ask your question.
I can't see that Eva's got a microphone.
Oh, maybe that's the problem.
Eva, we can see that you're there, but no microphone is showing. So
well,
you must
Eva,
have
if you have no microphone, just put it in the chat room question, and I'll answer it that way.
Okay, while we're waiting, we'll go to Ron. So Ron, please unmute yourself.
Hi, good evening. I'm Ron. Thank you for a very interesting introduction. By the way, just before I ask my question, I outside Vienna, I was visiting some family there some years ago, and I saw a war grave, and some of the dead soldiers had Jewish names. One called Levi, which was very, very disconcerting. A German war grave.
Yeah.
But the question I want to ask you is, did your research also extend to the Jewish soldiers in the Finnish army that fought on the side of Hitler, on the side of Germany?
Yeah.
And then how did they feel? I mean, these people must have survivors, and it must have been very difficult for them because they were in a different position to the German Jews, the Finnish Jews I'm talking about.
Yeah, you bring up a very interesting point. I mean, speaking of names, one thing, when I started working in the German archives, I was given special access to a lot of the personnel files. And so what I just naturally gravitated to is I started just looking up Cohen, Katz, Rosenberg, Levy, Lobenthal, and so on. And I found hundreds of Mischlinge soldiers that way. And it kind of skewed my research a little bit because I found about 60% of half-Jews had Jewish mothers. And about 30% of the quarter Jews had Jewish mothers, maternal line. But if you're only looking at the male line, it skews it a little bit. So my research is not a pure statistical study as far as, finding, whether there was more assimilation coming from Jewish women or Jewish men. But getting back to the names and getting back to the Jews in foreign militaries that were part of the Axis group, I did interview and talk to guys who served in the Finnish military. You mentioned the word Levi, the name Levi. One of Mussolini's main generals was Levi, who helped take over Ethiopia, and he was brought into the fascist, movement. There was a lot of Italian fascists who were Jewish, and Italian fascism didn't really get anti-Semitism until the links between Mussolini and Hitler started getting stronger and stronger in the late 30s. And remember, Mussolini took over in 1922. So getting to Finland, I documented a couple of units that were actually fighting right next to Waffen-SS units. And the Waffen-SS mess hall was right next to the field synagogue. And these guys go do their prayers and so on. They come out and they eat with their Waffen-SS comrades, and then they go out and they fight. One guy, Katz, rescued Waffen-SS squad, and later on, the Waffen-SS officer awards him an Iron Cross. So these guys were serving next to these Germans. They didn't know about the Holocaust. They knew about anti-Semitism and Nazi persecution of Jews. They didn't know that there was systematic extermination. They just hated Russia. Russia had invaded their country in 1940 with the Winter War. They wanted to kill the commies and keep them out of their country, and Germany was helping them do so, and they were good comrades.
Right.
You had a lot of Jews that served in the Hungarian military. You had a lot of Jews and people of Jewish descent who served in the Romanian military. I guesstimate there were tens of thousands, especially in the Hungarian military, that were of Jewish descent. And I started writing a chapter of this for my book, but I realized that this would need a whole nother book to really focus on. And I still haven't gotten around to write it, but I do have thousands of documents still in my home to use to write about that. So thank you, Ron, for that question.
Okay, now, David, I think you've got Eva's question, have you?
Yeah, the key point of it is there any proof that Eva Braun was Jewish?
Yeah, Eva Braun, who's Hitler's mistress in the whole war. At the very end, they got married, and then they committed suicide, and their honeymoon was burning together in a pit right outside of the Reichstag, when Otto Gutenberg carried out both their bodies. And try to do his last promise to the Fuhrer to make sure that he wasn't hung upside down in a center of the town like Mussolini was. So Eva Braun, they've done research, and she indeed had a Jewish, I believe, grandmother. So she was what the Nazis would have called a quarter Jew. So that has since come out in the last, it actually came out about 4 or 5 years after my work came out. I heard some rumors about it when I was doing research, but I wasn't necessarily focusing on that per se, because she wasn't in the military or didn't have any relatives that I knew of that were in the military. Now, what's interesting is Eva Braun, yes, has a Jewish background, but what's fascinating is that Magna Goebbels, the first lady of the Third Reich, she had a Jewish father. And he was in Buchenwald in 1939. So, you know, when you know about Goebbels and what a freak he was, and Magna also was a passionate Nazi, and she knew that she was adopted, but, you know, her father was really her stepfather, who she claimed. Her mother had married this Jew. They had divorced. She, you know, was birthed, and then when she was 1 year old, her mother married her stepfather, who later on became, you know, her adopted father. But everybody thought it was her biological father. But she knew who her real father was, and he was in Buchenwald in 1939, writing her to help him, and she refused. So Magna Goebbels actually was, quote unquote, a half Jew. Eva Braun was a quarter Jew. It just shows, you know, and there's research now, they've done DNA studies of Hitler and that he had Jewish background. The rumor out there is that, you know, his father, who was born out of wedlock, actually had a Jewish father. There's a lot of evidence showing that that was indeed the case. And it just shows you that these communities were so enmeshed in that there's not one pure anything, and that you have these, you know, Jews living in Germany and Austria for centuries. They're all mixed up. I mean, look at all of us, you know, right now. We're very Caucasian looking. We're very different than what our grandfathers looked like at Mount Sinai with Moses, you know. So this intermixing was going on all the time, and it just shows you the absurdity of Hitler's racial policy, that you could start hyphenating up humanity. And it's interesting that, you know, in Hitler, he had 2 girlfriends. One was a half Jew and one was a quarter Jew before Eva Braun. So it seemed like he gravitated to these so-called Mischlingen.
Okay, we've got Dennis and John. I think that might just about do it. So Dennis, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
It's not a question, it's actually a statement. When I was a student at university around the age of 20 or 21, I befriended a group of people, and one of them, her father was a dentist, and being a poor student, I couldn't afford to go to a proper dentist, and he was operating as a backyarder. He had a full setup in his house. He had a Nazi officer's photograph of himself hanging in the surgery, and he was Jewish, and his daughter was Jewish, and his wife was Jewish, but he had changed his name and somehow forged his papers, and he served for the entirety of the war as a dentist and an officer in the Wehrmacht.
Wow.
Yeah, you remember his name?
His surname was Fuchs, but I forget the first name.
Yeah.
So he took a very Germanic surname, but he changed it before or when Hitler came to power.
Yeah, you know, after my book, Hitler's Jewish Soldiers, came out, and I started doing talks starting in 2002, you know, when I stopped doing my research, I had over 600 men waiting for me to interview them who were either Jewish or half Jewish or quarter Jewish who served in the German military. And since my book's come out, I probably have heard about another 1,000 people like this from you that I could document. I could probably have up to now 3,000 to maybe 4,000 names of people, of Jewish citizens in the Nazi military. It was all over the place. But here again, once again, we were so, as a community, spread out all throughout Europe and had intermarried that it was very hard to cut us out of the body politic, you know, when Hitler came into power. So thank you for that story, Dennis.
Okay, we'll take John, and we might be able to squeeze in Mrs. Vorsheimer. So John, please
Hey,
unmute.
I can go hours, guys. I got nothing going on. It's only 3:50 in the morning. Nobody's bugging me.
Yeah.
So go ahead. What's the next question?
John, please ask your question. Unmute yourself and ask your question. Okay, nothing much happening. Okay, so while we're doing that, Mrs. P.A. Sarah Vorsheimer, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yes. My late husband, who left Germany as a Kindertransport child, he was from a Yekische family. They were strictly Orthodox, but they were also kind of German nationalist. His family was saved by an original member of the Nazi Party. So you can't say that all the Yekkers didn't like the religious Jews. But also I've read in Hamadiyah, and I've heard some other accounts of how some German soldiers who were secretly Jewish were rescuing Jews in trouble in the camps or whatever else. Have you heard of any of this?
Yeah, well, I have a very, thank you, Sarah, for the question. I have an interesting book I'd like to share with you. It's my fourth book. It's called The Rabbi Saved by Hitler's Soldiers. And it's the story of Lubavitcher Rebbe Joseph Isaac Schneerson, the sixth Lubavitcher Rebbe, Chabad, who was rescued by a half-Jew who had been Aryanized by Hitler, who was in the German Secret Service, and his name was Ernst Bloch. And he went with two other guys, Hamburger and Schenk. Hamburger was the grandchild of an Orthodox rabbi who had taught him Yiddish. And he was the interpreter. And he was also in the German military. And this was a remarkable rescue story, because if you don't get the sixth Lubavitcher Rebbe out of Warsaw in 1939-1940, and they got him to America now where Chabad's headquarters is in Brooklyn, Crown Heights, you don't have the rescue of the seventh Lubavitcher Rebbe, Menachem Mendel Schneerson, which really made them famous, who died in 1994, and a lot of, the Chabad believes he's the Messiah, the Mashiach. But he was in Vichy, France, and they got him out. So if you don't have the rescue of that sixth Lubavitcher Rebbe, you don't have Chabad today, because they wouldn't have gotten out his son-in-law and his second cousin, Menachem Mendel Schneerson. So this was a remarkable rescue story, and I think one of the most amazing rescue stories of World War II. And of course, I have a 600-page book documenting it, and I researched it also for many years. There's another guy that's an interesting rescue story. It's in my Lives of Hitler's Jewish Soldiers. He was the great-great-grandson of Moses Mendelssohn, and his name was Franz Mendelssohn. And he built submarines for the German military. He was a captain. And when he was stationed in Bordeaux, he found a couple of the Jewish men who he had worked with in civilian life who built ships, and he helped get them out into Palestine, which was another crazy rescue story. So yes, there were many of these guys that did do some rescue actions. Many of them were rescuing their own relatives. You have some guys actually even going to camps and getting their relatives out of the camps because they were in their black Panzer uniform. One guy went to Sachsenhausen, said, "Give me my father. He's a World War I vet, and I'm serving right now as a tank commander." And they let him out. So they're all those remarkable stories, Sarah. So thank you for that question.
Yeah, thanks. Look, we do like to stick to our time, so we're going to wrap it up at this point. Bryan, I want to thank you for joining us. It's a fascinating subject, and you've certainly captivated our attention. Just do you have a website or somewhere where people can go to find out what you've done and where there some further resources might be?
Yeah, thank you, Alan. So if you're interested in buying books, they're great Hanukkah gifts. You can go to my website. It's just my name. It's www.bryanmarkrigg.com. Just like it's spelled that you have up here, Bryan with a Y as in Yankee, Mark, K as in Kilo, Rigg, R-I-G-G. And you can find my books and information there. And also Amazon has information on my books. And David has my contact information if you need help with research, or if you have some more profound questions about your family and so on, because I know the German archive system like the back of my hand. I'm more than happy to help out people with their research, or if they have questions about their family and so on. So thank you.
It's good. Thank you, Bryan. I'll just hand back to David for the closing remarks.
Okay, well, Bryan, thank you so much. You're quite a find, and one of the things that we discussed on inviting Bryan to join us this evening is he expressed a wish to come to Australia. So I think tonight you have earned multiple hosts, and we look forward to hosting you in Australia in the foreseeable future, Bryan.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah, I want to see my military buddy and now meet all my new friends that I met tonight.
Absolutely. Now, just to move on to what's going to be happening next week, we have an extraordinary subject next week as well. We become the first Jewish organisation in this country to host a representative of the Uyghur community talking about the persecution of the Uyghurs in under the communist China regime. Details here. This is an aerial photograph of one of the detention cum concentration camps where an estimated 1.5 million Uyghurs, and following on our subject tonight, if there's any community that has a moral imperative to help shine a light on this issue, I think it's ours. And finally, if anyone here is not yet supporting AJA, there's 3 things to do: like and follow the Facebook page, send an email to office@jewishassociation.org.au, and we'll put you on our list for future notifications. And of course, we need tangible support. So if you're not yet a member, and if you can provide any donation, that can be done via the website. So thank you again, Bryan. And,
yeah.
Okay.